Now, culture is a really powerful force that shapes human behaviour, and this includes shaping our perceptions, shaping our beliefs, and also our attitudes. Now, cultural norms influence how we interact with others and the world around us, and our brains are wired to adapt to these norms. Now, it's not always a smooth transition though, and when we try to adapt to cultural norms, this can sometimes be challenging, particularly in professional and personal settings where we've got a whole bunch of different cultures and they might clash. So let's take a look at cultural norms and the brain and how adapting influence strategies can impact professional and personal performance. Now, we look at this in two different ways. Neuroscience has shown us that cultural norms shape neural circuits in the brain, particularly in regions that are involved in things like social cognition and emotional processing. And one of the key findings of this, and this is really cool, is that your brain has what we know as what we call a cultural circuit. And that cultural circuit is activated when we encounter cultural stimuli. And that includes things like artifacts or language or symbols and behaviors. Now, this circuit involves your medial prefrontal cortex, your anterior cingulate cortex, and your insula, among other different regions and structures. And these regions are involved in social cognition, empathy, and emotion regulation. And they're particularly sensitive to cultural stimuli that are relevant to our identity and to our values. And that's what happens when this clash happens, is that there's a misalignment of identity and values. Now, for example, when we hear our native language or when we see a familiar cultural symbol, these regions in our brain, they show heightened activity, which indicates that our brains are adapting to that cultural context. Now, adapting to cultural norms can sometimes be challenging, particularly when the norms clash with our own cultural background or our own personal values. And in cases like that, the brain might experience a conflict between the cultural stimuli and our own beliefs and attitudes. And what this does is it makes our brain go, what do I do? And it can lead to cognitive dissonance, and it can lead to frustration and emotional distress. And this manifests itself in frustration, anxiety, or even anger. We can even get angry about this stuff. And it all really goes into this big boiling pot, and it affects our ability to communicate effectively with people and connect effectively with people and perform well in these professional and these personal settings. Because while we're busy trying to do all of this other stuff, at a fundamental level, we're trying to make sense of what's actually happening in the world around us. So to overcome this challenge, it's really important to develop adaptive influence strategies that allow us to navigate cultural differences and to communicate effectively across different cultures. Now, philosophy helps us a lot with this. It can provide really valuable insights into how we can achieve this goal. And one approach is to adopt a virtue ethics perspective. We love philosophy. It provides a lot of valuable insights into different ways that we can achieve different goals, and it lets us stretch our thinking a little bit, and then we come back behind it with the neuroscience and find out the way to make it sustainable and actually make that possible. And one way to do this is using virtue ethics perspective, and this emphasizes the cultivation of virtuous character traits like empathy, like humility, openness to different perspectives, and developing these kind of characteristics, we can become more sensitive to cultural differences, and that allows us to be more effective at adapting different cultural contexts. And that's really what it's about. It's about trying to reduce that friction between our norms and our values and other people's, and knowing that everybody's different and we can all coexist, and trying to find the beauty and the wonder in those two different things is what I find is really important, and approaching it with this sense of openness is so important. Now, another way that we can do this is we can adopt a pragmatist perspective, and this emphasizes the importance of experimentation and adaptation in response to changing circumstances. Now, in this view, cultural norms we see these as contingent and they're subject to change. So they're not fixed. So we've reduced that friction. And when we do that, we should be open to different values, different norms that aren't our own beliefs and aren't our own perspectives, and they're not our own attitudes. We're happy to have our attitudes challenged in light of new experiences and in light of exposure to different stimuli that we're not usually exposed to because of how we were raised or where we live or what we experience. Now, that sounds really great, right? But that approach requires a certain degree of flexibility and a certain degree of resilience. And also we need a willingness to learn. We need to be happy and comfortable with failure. We need to be comfortable with feedback and receiving feedback in practice. And this all goes towards forming these adaptive influence strategies, which is really reliant on the development of our underlying cognitive, motivational, and emotional skills and abilities to help us do these things. Because adaptive influence strategies, they're what they say, they're adaptive. So they take many, many different forms depending on the specific cultural context and the goals of the interaction as well. Now, one approach to do this is something that we call cultural bridging. And cultural bridging techniques aim to establish common ground and to build rapport with people from different cultures. Now, a great way to, there's a lot of different ways to do this. We can use humor, we can share personal stories, or we can engage in social activities that are valued in different cultures. And one of the ones that we love to do this with is food. Food is so great at connecting cultures because people love food. Food lights up a lot of the same receptors, and it releases a lot of the same chemicals as other pleasure-seeking activities like sex. And that's why people tend to overeat, because we're getting a lot of that same satisfaction that we do from pleasure-based activities. So food is a great cultural bridge that allows us all to engage in something that is pleasurable and starts to break down those walls a little bit. And by building things like resilience and empathy, we can actually create a more favorable environment for communication and collaboration. And that's really what it's all about. Now, another approach to this is you might not even be at that stage where you're ready to build that bridge because you don't really know what's on the other side. It might seem a little bit scary, right? And I get that. Our brains are geared for us not to like change, and it's geared for us to seek safety, and it's geared for us to seek belonging. So it's geared for us to seek out familiarity. So when we come into contact with a culture or anything that's a little bit different and you want to be a little bit open-minded, there's an approach that you can take which is called cultural decoding. And cultural decoding techniques aim to understand the underlying values and assumptions that drive particular types of particular influences in culture. And we're trying to really look at, where are the assets? Where are the artifacts of this culture so I can understand it a little bit? We want to look for cultural mentors, people that we can look to that are representing this culture and that we can connect to. And this really involves things like studying the language, and studying the underlying factors that are driving the customs, of this culture, as well as seeking feedback from these mentors and from people who are familiar and are in and a part of this culture. And when we move down the path of cultural decoding, this allows us to cultivate a deeper understanding of the cultural context. And this lets us avoid misunderstandings so that we can adapt our own communication style and we can be more effective in creating those cultural bridges. Now, finally, it is really important to recognize that cultural norms are not static. These are things that are subjective, they differ from person to person, and they change over time as well. So by engaging in constructive dialogue and mutual learning, we can actually start to contribute to the evolution of cultural norms, and we can lead them down a path in a very positive direction. Now, all this actually requires, it's really simple. It just requires a willingness to listen and a willingness to learn from others, as well as a willingness to share our own perspectives and our own experiences in a respectful and in a constructive manner. It sounds easy, right? And the thing is, it is easy once we get past that initial friction, once we get past that initial part where our brain says, no, don't know what that is, unfamiliar. Can I please just retreat back into my little level of safety? We've just got to shift past that a little bit. And once we do, it's pretty easy, it's pretty easy to actually get things moving in a positive direction, so long as we've got the right underlying cognitive, emotional, motivational skills. We just need to listen. We need to be respectful. We need to be open. We need to be willing to share. That's what it is, because cultural norms are really, really powerful, but they shape so much of who we are. They shape human behavior. Our brains are hardwired to adapt to these cultural norms. And when we're adapting to cultural differences, it can be a little bit challenging, particularly in professional settings, particularly in personal settings as well. And to overcome those challenges, it's just really important to develop adaptive influence strategies that allow you to navigate these cultural differences and to communicate effectively across different cultures. And remember, this isn't all verbal. 93% of communication is non-verbal. So keep in mind that just because you don't talk the same language, it doesn't mean that you can't connect. Now, when we draw on insights from neuroscience and philosophy, we can cultivate virtues like empathy, humility, openness, different perspective taking, as well as looking at those more pragmatic type of approaches that emphasize experimentation and adaptation. And by using cultural bridging and cultural decoding techniques, we can build trust, we can build understanding across different cultures, we can reduce conflict, and we can contribute, this is the important part, we can contribute to the positive evolution of cultural norms in a very respectful, a very constructive, a very positive way. So where does this get us? Well, ultimately, it can lead us to a more nuanced approach to influence, and that's going to allow us to improve that professional and that personal performance. And here's the best part, along the way, we're going to be building a more harmonious and a more inclusive society. Sounds good to me. See you next time.